The fluorescent lights in Kaufman's office made everything look like it had that typical government building glow that made even healthy people look a bit sick. I sat in the metal chair across from his desk, taking out my notebook and pen like I always do. Another assignment briefing. Another remote location where I'd spend days collecting samples and data that would disappear into some classified filing system. Kaufman pushed a manila folder across the desk without looking up from his computer screen. He kept typing, finishing whatever report he was working on before he finally looked at me. "Biological survey," he said, finally glancing at me. 3 days. Maine coast. Island designation is classified, but coordinates are in the folder. I opened the folder and looked over the assignment sheet. Standard stuff. Catalog existing plant and animal species, collect soil samples, photograph any unusual flora. The island looked small on the satellite image, maybe 2 square miles of dense forest surrounding a single structure near the shore. Looked straightforward enough. I flipped through the pages, noting the equipment list and timeline. Any particular species you're looking for? Complete documentation, everything you find. Kaufman pulled open his desk drawer and withdrew a single sheet of handwritten paper. The penmanship was careful, almost childlike in its precision. "Before we discuss logistics, you need to memorize this." I reached for the paper, but he held it back. "Memorize completely, word for word, then we destroy it." That got my attention. I'd worked enough government contracts to know when something changed from routine to classified, but this felt different. The careful handwriting, the emphasis on memorization. It reminded me more of spy novels than biological field work. Kaufman placed the paper in front of me. 7 numbered items, each one stranger than the last. 1. Stay on island no longer than 72 hours. 2. Follow meal schedule exactly. Breakfast, 8 a.m., lunch 12 p.m., dinner 6 p.m. 3. Do not speak to James Ballard under any circumstances. 4. Avoid children in the forest. 5. Avoid women in white dresses. 6. If voices call your name, do not respond or investigate. 7. Verify boat captain identity. Gray beard, scar above left eyebrow. I read through the list twice, then looked up at Kaufman. He was watching me with that neutral expression he wore when delivering information he knew would raise questions. "James Ballard is the other surveyor?" "Correct. And I'm not supposed to speak to him." I read the line again. "At all. Under any circumstances." I set the paper down and leaned back in the chair. "Mr. Kaufman, these don't read like safety protocols. They read like..." I searched for the right words. "Like instructions for avoiding ghosts. They're standard safety measures for this particular location. Standard safety measures don't usually involve avoiding children or people in white dresses." I tapped the paper with my finger. "What kind of biological hazards are we talking about here?" Kaufman's expression didn't change. The kind that require specific behavioral guidelines. His non-answer was answer enough. I'd learned not to push too hard when he went into bureaucratic deflection mode, but this felt different from the usual classified elements of my work. Those involved restricted information about the research itself, what we were looking for, why we were looking for it. This list read like a survival guide. "The meal schedule," I said, trying a different angle. "Why does that matter for collecting samples? Following the schedule exactly is important for your safety. And if voices call my name, do not respond or investigate." Each answer came with the same flat tone, like he was reading from a script. I looked down at the list again, trying to remember each word. The handwriting bugged me almost as much as what was written. Too careful, too perfect, like someone had practiced writing these instructions over and over. "How many people have you sent to this island?" Kaufman's pause lasted just long enough to confirm my suspicions. "You're not the first surveyor assigned to this location. And the others followed these rules?" "The ones who followed them, yes." That phrasing made me feel cold in a way that had nothing to do with the office air conditioning. The ones who followed them, not all of them, not everyone. The ones who followed them. I looked over the list again, trying to remember not just the words, but where they were on the page. Do not speak to James Ballard under any circumstances. Avoid children in the forest. Verify boat captain identity. Mr. Kaufman, I said, looking up at him, what happens if I don't follow these rules? For the first time since I'd known him, something shifted in his expression. Not quite emotion, but a crack in that professional facade. Following these rules exactly could save your life, Sarah. The use of my first name hit me harder than any warning could have. Kaufman never used first names. Ever. In 2 years of working for his department, I'd been Mitchell, or occasionally Ms. Mitchell if civilian contractors were present. Never Sarah. I memorized the list one more time, then pushed it back across the desk. Kaufman picked up a metal ashtray from his bookshelf and set it between us. He handed me a book of matches. The paper caught quickly, curling at the edges as the ink disappeared. I watched the handwriting dissolve into ash, each rule vanishing. But they were burned into my memory now, every word of them. Kaufman stirred the ashes with a pen, making sure nothing readable remained. Your transport leaves at 0800 tomorrow. Captain Torres will handle the boat. Gray beard, scar above left eyebrow. Correct. I closed the folder and stood, slinging my bag over my shoulder. 3 days on an island collecting plant samples shouldn't have felt like a dangerous assignment, but the weight of those memorized rules made it feel like something else entirely. Any questions about the survey work itself? No, sir. I paused at the door. Just to confirm, I'm not supposed to talk to my partner at all? James Ballard is not your partner, Sarah. He's another surveyor who happens to be on the island, and you will not speak to him under any circumstances. The distinction felt important, though I couldn't figure out why. I went out of Kaufman's office with the assignment folder tucked under my arm and a growing certainty that this job would be unlike any biological survey I'd ever conducted. The equipment room was empty when I arrived to gather my gear. I pulled my standard survey kit from the shelf, sample containers, collection tools, camera, notebooks, GPS unit. Everything looked normal and familiar. Just the tools of my trade, the same equipment I'd used dozens of times before. But as I packed everything into my field bag, those 7 rules kept cycling through my mind. Do not speak to James Ballard under any circumstances. Avoid children in the forest. If voices call your name, do not respond or investigate. I signed out the equipment and headed for the parking garage, wondering what kind of biological hazards could require such specific behavioral guidelines. The assignment felt different from my usual work, but government contracts often involved classified elements I wasn't meant to understand. Even so, as I drove through the city toward my apartment to pack personal items for the trip, I couldn't shake the feeling that I just agreed to something far more dangerous than collecting plant samples on a remote island. The rules played on repeat in my head, each one more troubling than the last. Whatever waited for me on that island, Kaufman's department had developed very specific protocols for dealing with it, and according to him, following those protocols exactly might be the only thing standing between me and whatever had happened to the surveyors who hadn't. I checked my watch for the 3rd time in 10 minutes, though the boat's engine noise hadn't changed since we'd left the mainland dock. 2 hours, Torres had said. The diesel fumes mixed with salt air, and I found myself watching the man at the helm instead of looking at the coastline behind us. Gray beard, definitely. Thick and well-kept, with streaks of white running through it from years of sea spray and wind. The scar above his left eyebrow showed when he turned to check our direction, a straight line about an inch long that looked old. His hands moved over the controls with the confidence of someone who'd made this trip many times before. I pulled out my notebook and pretended to review my equipment list, but really, I was memorizing his face, the deep lines around his eyes, the way his mouth stayed in a straight line, his rough skin from years outdoors. If someone else showed up claiming to be Captain Torres, I'd know the difference. First time out to this island? Torres asked, not taking his eyes off the water ahead. Yes. He nodded once, like that explained something. then went back to navigating. The conversation died there, which suited me fine. I had enough to think about without making small talk. The island showed up as a dark smudge on the horizon first, then slowly became clearer as we got closer. Thick pine forest covered most of it, with trees growing right down to the rocky shoreline in most places. A small dock stuck out from the only clear area I could see, with a one-story cabin about 50 yards from the water. The place looked ordinary, just like any of the dozens of small islands along the main coast. Torres pulled the boat up to the dock smoothly, barely touching the wooden posts as he turned off the engine. It was suddenly very quiet after 2 hours of motor noise. "I'll help with your gear," he said, already moving toward the equipment I'd loaded that morning. We worked quietly, moving my survey equipment from the boat to the dock. Field bag, sample containers, camera equipment, GPS unit, the small cooler with my lunch for tomorrow. Everything I'd need for 3 days of biological surveys, all perfectly normal and something I was used to. Torres pointed toward the cabin as he handed me the last bag. Radios on the kitchen table, channel 16 for emergencies, channel 12 for regular check-ins. Meal schedules posted inside. "When will you be back?" 3 days, 1,500 hours. He was already untying the dock lines, ready to leave. "Follow the protocols and you'll be fine." The boat engine rumbled back to life, and I watched him drive away from the dock just as carefully as he'd come in. Within minutes, he was just a tiny dot on the water, then disappeared completely. Everything got quiet around me, except for the soft sound of waves hitting the rocks and wind blowing through the pine trees. I put my field bag on my shoulder and started walking to the cabin, looking at my temporary home. Trees grew close on 3 sides. A small path went from the dock to the cabin's front door, with what looked like several other trails going into the forest. I'd check those out tomorrow when I started the actual survey work. I noticed something moving near the trees to my left. A man came out from between the pines, walking toward me. He was medium height, with light brown hair, wearing field clothes like mine. Khaki pants, button-up shirt with rolled-up sleeves, and a vest with lots of pockets. He had a clipboard and was wearing what looked like an official watch. "Sarah Mitchell," he called out, raising one hand in greeting. "I'm James Ballard. I've been waiting for you to arrive." The name stunned me. James Ballard. Do not speak to James Ballard under any circumstances. The rule played back in my mind clearly, along with Kaufman's measured voice saying it. James kept walking toward me, his face open and friendly. "I've been reviewing the survey parameters while I waited. I think we should start with the eastern shoreline tomorrow morning. The botanical diversity looks promising from what I've seen so far." I turned away from him and started walking faster toward the cabin. The gravel crunched under my boots, and I could hear his footsteps following behind me. "I brought some additional collection tools that might be useful," he continued, his voice carrying easily in the still air. "Soil corer, pH testing kit, extra sample containers. I figured we could coordinate our methodology to avoid duplication of effort. Do not speak to James Ballard under any circumstances." The instruction was clear, unambiguous. I kept my eyes on the cabin door ahead of me, refusing to look back or acknowledge his presence in any way. "Sarah, I know this arrangement is unusual, but I think we can make it work efficiently if we plan our approach together." His voice sounded genuinely puzzled now, like he couldn't understand why I wasn't responding. I quickened my pace, almost jogging toward the cabin. 20 more yards. 15. 10. "Look, I don't know what kind of briefing you received, but we're supposed to be working as a team here. The survey area is small enough that we'll be running into each other constantly if we don't coordinate." I reached the cabin door and grabbed the handle, my heart racing from the fast walk and the growing tension of ignoring someone who seemed genuinely confused by my behavior. James was still talking, still following, his footsteps getting closer. At least tell me what sectors you're planning to focus on. We can work out a schedule that makes sense for both of... I yanked the door open, rushed inside, and slammed it behind me. My hands shook as I turned the deadbolt, then the chain lock. The small bathroom was just off the main room, and I ran for it, slamming that door too before turning the lock. The bathroom was tiny, barely large enough for a toilet, sink, and narrow shower stall. I sat on the closed toilet seat and pressed my hands to my knees, trying to steady my breathing. Outside, I could hear James's voice, muffled now by two doors and the cabin walls. "Sarah, are you okay? Did I say something wrong?" "Recite the alphabet backward as instructed." Another piece of the protocol I'd memorized, though I couldn't remember Kaufman specifically mentioning it during our briefing. Maybe it had been in some other documentation, or maybe my mind was filling in details from stress. Either way, the instruction felt as clear and necessary as the rules about avoiding James. Z, Y, X, W, V, U, T, S, R, Q, P, O, N, M, L, K, J, I, H, G, F, E, D, C, B, A. I whispered the letters under my breath, focusing on getting the sequence right. The familiar structure of the exercise helped slow my racing thoughts. Z, Y, X, W, V, U, T, S, R, Q, P, O, N, M, L, K, J, I, H, G, F, E, D, C, B, A. James's voice had stopped. I waited, listening for footsteps or any sign of movement outside the bathroom door. The cabin had gone completely quiet. I counted to 60, then to 60 again, before slowly unlocking the bathroom door and opening it a crack. The main room of the cabin was empty. I could see through the front windows that the area around the door was clear too. James was gone. I walked through the cabin, looking at each window to make sure he wasn't waiting outside somewhere. The place was simple: a small kitchen, living area with a table and chairs, two narrow bedrooms, and the bathroom I'd just left. Everything was clean and tidy. A laminated sheet was taped to the wall next to the kitchen table. Meal schedule printed in block letters at the top, with 3 simple lines below. Breakfast. 800 hours lunch, 1200 hours dinner, 1800 hours. I checked my watch. 5:47 p.m. 13 minutes until dinner time. The refrigerator had basic supplies: sandwich stuff, some pre-made meals, bottled water. A note taped to the inside of the door listed the contents and when they'd expire. Everything was organized really carefully, just what I'd expect from government arrangements. At exactly 6 p.m., I heated one of the pre-made meals in the small microwave and sat at the kitchen table to eat. Chicken and rice, vegetables, a bread roll. It tasted like cafeteria food, but I was hungry enough that it didn't matter. As I ate, I kept thinking about meeting James. He seemed really caught off guard by my refusal to talk to him, like he actually expected us to work together. His questions about survey methods had been specific and smart. He clearly knew the work. But the rules were clear. Do not speak to James Ballard under any circumstances. The other surveyor who happens to be on the island, Kaufman had said, not your partner. That difference seemed more important now that I'd met James face to face. After dinner, I unpacked my survey equipment and spread it out on the table to check everything for tomorrow's work. Sample containers, collection tools, camera, GPS unit, field notebooks. All there. I put fresh batteries in the GPS and camera, checked that my sample labels were organized, and went over the survey instructions one more time. The island map showed the areas I needed to cover over the next 3 days. Eastern shoreline, western slopes, interior forest sections. Standard biological survey work: document existing species, collect representative samples, take pictures of anything unusual. The kind of job I'd done dozens of times before. But as I organized my equipment and planned tomorrow's route, one question kept bugging me. If James Ballard was here to do similar survey work, and if he clearly knew what he was doing, why couldn't I talk to him? What could be so dangerous about working together that it needed such strict rules? I packed everything back into my field bag and set it by the door, ready for an early start tomorrow. Outside, the island was quiet, with only the distant sound of waves and the occasional rustle of wind through the trees. Whatever the reason for the rules about James Ballard, I'd followed them exactly as told. 3 days on this island, doing surveys alone, speaking to no one. I could handle that. The question was whether James would make it that easy. I woke up before my alarm. The quiet of the island made it hard to sleep past dawn. No traffic, no city noise, just the far-off sound of waves hitting rocks and wind blowing through pine trees. I got used to being alone faster than I thought I would. The kitchen clock said 6:30 a.m. when I walked over to make coffee. I had plenty of time before the required 8:00 breakfast, but I wanted to check my planned route while my head was clear. The eastern shore looked good on the map, different heights, several soil types, and a good chance of finding various plant groups to document. I laid out my field notebooks on the kitchen table and looked over yesterday's notes. The island's plants were normal for this area: white pine, red spruce, some hardwoods in the sheltered spots. But I'd seen a few plants that seemed a bit out of place for how far north we were. Plants that should be growing further south. Worth checking out today. At exactly 8 eggs, I heated another pre-made meal and ate while studying the map of my survey area. Oatmeal and fruit, coffee, orange juice. The strict meal timing still seemed weird, but I'd followed stranger rules in my government work. By 8:45, I was outside with my field bag packed and my GPS showing the route to the eastern shore. The morning air was cool off the ocean, smelling of salt mixed with pine and dirt. Perfect weather for field work. The trail to the eastern shore went through thick pine forest for about half a mile before opening onto a rocky coastline. Waves had shaped the granite into cool formations, making small pockets where unusual plants might grow. I started my survey at the northernmost point, working south along the shore, taking photos, collecting samples, making notes. The routine of fieldwork helped calm me down. I filled containers with soil from different heights, carefully labeled plant samples, and stored them. I took pictures to show where each sample came from. This was the work I knew, the part of the job that made sense. Around 11:30, I found something really interesting. A small group of hart's tongue ferns growing in a crack between two granite boulders. These ferns are rare this far north, usually found in warmer places. I knelt down to take pictures of the fronds from different angles, changing my camera settings to catch their glossy green color. Looking through the viewfinder, I set up the shot carefully. The ferns filled the frame nicely, their smooth fronds catching the light. I took the picture, then lowered the camera to check it on the screen. Something moved at the edge of my sight, making me look up. A woman stood among the pine trees about 50 yards inland from where I knelt. She wore a plain white dress that looked old-fashioned, like a simple cotton outfit from decades ago. Her long dark hair hung over her face, hiding it completely. She stood completely still, arms at her sides, not even moving slightly in the breeze that shook the pine branches around her. Avoid women in white dresses. The rule hit me with total clarity. I didn't wait to see more. I quickly put my camera in my field bag, grabbed my sample containers, and started walking fast back toward the trail. Not running. Something told me not to run, but moving quickly. I reached the trees and risked one look back. The woman was still there, still not moving, still facing my way, though I couldn't see her face behind her hair. Seeing her made me feel cold all over. The walk back to the cabin felt longer than it should have. I kept my eyes on the trail ahead, refusing to look around or listen for footsteps behind me. When I saw the cabin, I walked faster, reaching for the door key before I even got to the porch. Inside, I locked the door and put on the chain, then made sure all windows were closed. The small space felt safer with walls between me and whatever I'd seen in the forest. I put my field bag on the kitchen table and tried to understand what just happened. A woman in a white dress, standing still in the trees. The rule about avoiding them suddenly felt less random and more like important survival info. The kitchen clock showed 11:58. 2 minutes until required lunchtime. I heated another pre-made meal and sat at the table, though I wasn't hungry anymore. Chicken sandwich, chips, apple juice. I made myself eat, following the schedule exactly as told. While eating, I looked over the morning's data. 43 plant samples, soil from 8 different spots, over 100 photos. Good progress, even with the cut-short survey. The heart's tongue ferns alone made the morning worthwhile scientifically, but I couldn't stop thinking about the woman in white. How long had she been standing there? Had she been watching me work? Her stillness bothered me most. No fidgeting, no shifting her position, no reaction to the wind or sounds around her. After lunch, I studied the map and planned a different route for the afternoon. The western side of the island had varied ground and should give good diversity for sampling. Different area, different plants, different part of my survey grid. At 1:15, I put fresh batteries in my GPS and headed out again. The western trail was narrower and went up more steeply through mixed hardwood forest. Oak, maple, and birch made a different tree cover than the pine areas I'd worked that morning. The soil here was richer, supporting different plant types. I found what I wanted about half a mile up the slope, a small clearing where the tree cover opened enough to let in more light. Wildflowers and low bushes made just the kind of spot that often had unusual species, perfect for afternoon sampling. I knelt near the middle of the clearing and started collecting soil from different depths, writing down the color and texture in my field notebook. I recorded the GPS coordinates along with height and slope measurements. Careful work that needed focus and helped push away thoughts of women in white dresses standing still in the forest. The soil tool dug into the ground with a crunching sound. I put sample after sample into labeled containers, each one tagged with exact location info. I was reaching for my camera to take pictures of the sampling site when a voice came through the trees. "Help me." I froze with my hand on the camera case. The voice was high, thin, like a child's voice carried on the wind. "Please help me." It came from deeper in the forest, upslope from the clearing. I slowly raised my head and looked around the tree line. A small figure moved between the trunks, maybe 30 yards away. A boy, perhaps 8 years old, with messy brown hair and pale skin. He wore simple clothes, short pants and a button-up shirt that looked oddly formal, like something from an older time. He was walking toward the clearing with his arms stretched out in front of him, as if reaching for something or someone. "Help me, please." I didn't hesitate this time. The sample containers went into my field bag in one quick motion. I slung the bag over my shoulder and ran. Behind me, the child's voice continued calling, but I didn't look back. The trail down the slope was steep and rocky, but I took it as fast as I dared. Branches whipped at my arms and face as I crashed through the bushes, abandoning any attempt at careful movement. The cabin appeared through the trees, and I sprinted the last 50 yards across the open ground. The door key stuck for a moment before turning, and I practically fell inside before slamming the door and throwing the locks. My hands shook as I pulled out the radio from the kitchen table. "Channel 12 for regular check-ins," Torres had said. I turned the dial and pressed the transmit button. "Base, this is Survey Team 1. Do you copy?" Static crackled for several seconds before a voice responded. "Survey Team 1, this is Base. Go ahead. I need to report an incident. I paused, realizing how it would sound. "I encountered individuals on the island during my survey work." "Copy that, Survey Team 1. Are you currently in a secure location?" "Yes, I'm in the cabin." "Remain in the cabin until further notice. Do not go outside for any reason. Acknowledge." "Acknowledged. How long should I—" "Remain in the cabin, Survey Team 1. We'll contact you with further instructions." The radio went silent. I set it back on the table and checked all the window locks again, then pulled the curtains closed. The cabin felt smaller with the windows covered, but safer too. I spent the rest of the afternoon organizing my samples and updating my field notes. The scientific work helped me stay focused. Hart's tongue ferns, soil data, GPS coordinates, photo references, all normal biological survey documentation. At 6 p.m., I heated dinner and ate at the kitchen table. Beef stew, bread roll, green beans. The routine of eating meals on schedule felt more important now, one of the few things I could control in this weird situation. After dinner, I spread out my notebooks and began writing up the day's observations. Species lists, habitat descriptions, collection protocols. Standard scientific documentation for my final report. Nothing about women in white dresses or children calling for help in the forest. The work kept me busy as night fell over the island. I wrote notes about soil pH, plant types, and took pictures of specimens. By 10:30, I'd filled 12 pages with observations and data. At exactly 11 p.m., someone knocked on the cabin door. 3 sharp raps, then silence. I looked up from my notebook and waited. The knocking came again, louder this time. 6 rapid knocks, then nothing. If voices call your name, do not respond or investigate. The rule didn't mention knocking, but the point seemed clear. I went back to my notes, trying to ignore the sound. The knocking started again, but now it was joined by a voice. "Let me in." My blood went cold. The voice was mine. Not similar to mine, not close to mine. It was exactly my voice, speaking from the other side of the cabin door. "Please let me in. I'm locked out." The voice carried the same slight hoarseness I got when I was tired, the same inflection pattern I'd heard on recordings of myself. It was my voice asking to be led into the cabin where I sat. I set down my pen and pushed back from the table, moving as quietly as possible to the center of the main room. The knocking continued, steady and patient. "Sarah, I know you're in there. Please open the door." My name, spoken in my own voice. The sound made my skin crawl, and I had no words for it. I pressed my hands over my ears and closed my eyes, but I could still hear it through the walls. "I'm so cold out here. Just let me in for a few minutes." The pleading tone was perfect, exactly how I might sound if I were actually locked out in the night air. But I was inside, sitting in the middle of the cabin, listening to something that was using my voice. The knocking went on for what felt like hours, sometimes accompanied by my voice, sometimes just the rhythmic sound of knuckles against wood. I sat in the chair and looked at my notebook, trying to focus on plant taxonomy and soil composition data while something outside used my own voice to try to get me to open the door. Around midnight, the sound stopped. No final knock, no parting words, just sudden silence that seemed worse than the noise had been. I waited another hour before moving from the chair. When I finally crept to one of the front windows and pulled the curtain aside just enough to peek out, the area around the door was empty. Everything was still outside. I didn't sleep that night. I sat at the kitchen table with my back to the wall and all the lights on, going over my survey notes and trying to understand what I'd experienced. A woman in white standing still in the forest. A child with arms stretched out calling for help. My own voice begging to be led into the cabin where I already sat. As morning light started coming through the gaps in the curtains, I finally understood why the rules existed. They weren't random safety measures or government protocols. They were survival instructions for dealing with things that shouldn't exist, but clearly did. Whatever was on this island, the government knew about it. They'd created specific procedures for avoiding it, and they sent people like me to conduct surveys while following those procedures exactly. I'd followed them perfectly so far, and I was still alive. That had to count for something. I spent the morning going through my final survey sections like a robot, just wanting to get off this island as fast as possible. After not sleeping, I felt jumpy but super focused, which made me cut corners to finish the work. No taking my time collecting samples today. No long photo sessions. Just the bare minimum to complete the assignment. The shoreline areas near the cabin seemed safest for my remaining collections. I stayed away from the eastern shore where I'd seen the woman in white, and I definitely wasn't going back to the western slopes where the child had called out. Instead, I worked along the southern coastline, an area I hadn't fully checked yet, always keeping the cabin in sight. I collected 42 more plant specimens in labeled containers, soil samples from 6 different heights, GPS coordinates for every collection point. I took quick but thorough photos of each habitat, checking the display to make sure I got enough detail. The work felt automatic now, while my mind kept watch for any movement in the trees. By noon, I'd finished everything needed for a complete biological survey of the island. 3 days' worth of data, properly collected and documented according to the rules. Anyone looking at my field notes would see a normal scientific trip with no missing information. I ate lunch at exactly 12 hours, forcing down another pre-made meal while checking my equipment one last time. Everything packed and ready to go. GPS unit turned off and put away. Camera batteries fresh. Sample containers organized by collection date and location. Going through this checklist helped calm my nerves as pickup time got closer. At 2:45, I carried my field bag and equipment cases outside and put them near the dock. The afternoon was clear and calm, perfect for boat travel. I stood at the end of the wooden planks and looked across the water, watching for Torres's boat. Right on time, a boat appeared as a tiny dot at exactly 3 p.m. I pulled out my binoculars and watched it come closer, noting the shape and size. It looked like the same boat that dropped me off 3 days ago, moving steadily toward the island. As it got closer, I could make out the person steering. My stomach dropped. Even from far away, something was wrong. The person driving the boat was too tall and moved differently. I kept the binoculars pointed at the approaching boat as details became clear. The captain was younger than Torres by at least 20 years. Athletic build, clean-shaven face, blonde hair under a baseball cap. No gray beard, no scar above the left eyebrow. This wasn't Captain Torres. The boat pulled up to the dock smoothly, but the man who tied it up was definitely not the person who'd brought me to the island. He looked up at me with a friendly smile and raised one hand to say hello. "Ready to head back, Sarah?" I was already moving toward the cabin before he finished speaking. The radio sat on the kitchen table where I'd left it after yesterday's contact with base. I turned it to channel 12 and pressed the transmit button. "Base, this is Survey Team 1. Emergency protocol activation." The response came immediately. "Survey Team 1, go ahead. Pickup boat has arrived, but captain identity doesn't match established parameters. Requesting verification." "Copy that, Survey Team 1. Remain in your current location and do not board the vessel. Acknowledge." Acknowledged. How long should I? "Do not board the vessel under any circumstances. Wait for further instructions." I set the radio down and moved to the front window, pulling the curtain aside just enough to see the dock. The man was still there, now unloading equipment from the boat. He worked quickly, setting out what looked like additional survey gear on the wooden planks. "Sarah?" His voice carried clearly across the 50 yards between the cabin and the dock. "Everything okay? We need to load your equipment and head back before the weather changes." The voice stopped me cold. It was Torres's voice. Not similar to Torres's voice, it was exactly his voice with the same gruff tone and slight Maine accent. But the man speaking was 30 years younger, with blonde hair and no facial scars. "Sarah, come on, I know you're in there. We're on a schedule here." The voice was perfect, but the words were wrong. Torres had never used my first name, never called me anything but Survey Team 1 on the radio. He was professional but distant, not casual or familiar. I stayed away from the windows and waited. Outside, the false captain continued trying to coax me out of the cabin. "Look, I know I look different. Had to shave the beard for a medical procedure, and the scar. Well, plastic surgery works wonders these days. But it's me, Captain Torres. Same boat, same schedule, same route back to the mainland." The explanation sounded reasonable, but the rules had been specific. Gray beard and scar above the left eyebrow. Those were the identifying features, and this person had neither. No matter what story he told, no matter how perfectly he reproduced Torres's voice, He wasn't the right captain. Sarah, this is getting ridiculous. I've got other pickups to make today, and the harbor master gets cranky when boats run behind schedule. Just grab your gear and let's go. The tone was changing now, becoming less patient and more demanding. I could hear frustration creeping into the words, though the voice itself remained Torres's exact inflection and accent. 20 minutes passed with the fake captain switching between sweet-talking and increasingly sharp demands. I stayed in the cabin, keeping an eye on him through quick peeks out the windows. He'd moved closer to the building, standing near the front door now instead of down at the dock. Fine. You want to play games? I'll wait right here until you come out. But every minute we waste is another minute in rough seas on the way back. The threat was subtle, but clear. Get on the boat voluntarily or face consequences. I checked the radio again, but got only static when I tried to contact base. Either they were monitoring the situation remotely, or the equipment was being jammed somehow. For the next hour, the false captain paced around the cabin. I tracked his movement from room to room, staying away from the windows, but keeping tabs on where he was. Sometimes he called out additional pleas or threats, always in Torres's perfect voice. Sometimes he just walked, his footsteps crunching on the gravel and fallen pine needles. At 4:15, he gave up. I heard the boat engine start, then watched through the bathroom window as the boat pulled away from the dock. Instead of heading directly back toward the mainland, it began a slow trip around the island. For another 45 minutes, I could see it moving along the coastline, sometimes disappearing behind rocky outcroppings, but always reappearing. The boat finally disappeared in the direction of the mainland at 5 p.m. I stayed in the cabin and waited, uncertain whether this was really over or just another phase of whatever game was being played. At 5:30, another boat appeared, smaller this time, approaching more carefully than the first one. I got out the binoculars and studied the approaching captain closely. Gray beard, thick and well-kept, weathered face with deep lines around the eyes, the noticeable scar above the left eyebrow, easy to see even from far away. This was Captain Torres, the real one. I grabbed my equipment and headed for the dock, feeling relieved as the familiar boat pulled alongside the wooden planks. Torres tied up the lines with the same quick movements I remembered from 3 days ago, then looked up at me with an expression I couldn't quite read. "You okay?" he asked, already reaching for my field bag. "Yes. Someone else came by earlier with a different boat. I followed the verification protocols." Torres nodded like this was exactly what he'd expected to hear. "Good. That's why the protocols exist." We loaded my equipment quietly, just like when I'd arrived. Field bag, sample containers, camera equipment, all packed up for the trip back. Torres worked professionally, but he looked different now. Relieved, maybe. Or happy that I'd done what I was supposed to. The boat engine started up and we left the dock. I watched the island get smaller behind us. For the first time in 3 days, I felt safe. Being on the boat with the engine running and Torres driving made everything feel normal again. 20 minutes into the trip back, I walked up near the wheelhouse. Torres was looking ahead at the water, but he seemed more relaxed now that we were far from the island. "Can I ask you something?" I said. He glanced at me, then back at the horizon. "Depends on the question." "Have you ever heard of someone named James Ballard working surveys on that island?" Torres was quiet for so long I thought he wasn't going to answer. Finally, he shook his head. "No James Ballard. Never heard that name connected to any of the work out there." "What about the other things? The woman in white? The child in the forest?" This time Torres stopped looking at the water and studied my face directly. His expression was serious, almost sad. "Some places aren't meant for people to understand," he said. "That island's one of them. The government's got their reasons for sending folks out there, and they've got their rules for keeping those folks safe. You followed the rules, so you're sitting here talking to me instead of..." He trailed off and went back to watching the horizon. "Instead of what?" Torres didn't answer. He changed our course slightly and pushed the throttle up, making us go faster toward the mainland. The island was gone behind us now, just another dark spot in the wide ocean. I spent the rest of the trip organizing my field notes and making sure my sample containers were sealed properly. This was just regular post-survey work, the routine of scientific documentation. But while doing these normal tasks, I kept thinking about questions. Who had sent the fake captain? How had he copied Torres's voice so well? What happened to surveyors who didn't follow the rules as carefully as I had? We could see the mainland dock ahead as evening came over the water. Torres brought the boat in smoothly, barely touching the pilings as he turned off the engine. The quiet now felt different, not scary with isolation and unknown threats, but calm in the way you feel when you're safe after real danger. "Transportation back to your vehicle is arranged," Torres said as he helped me unload my equipment. "Report to your supervisor tomorrow at Oro 900. I shouldered my field bag and picked up my sample cases, then paused at the edge of the dock. Torres was already preparing to cast off, ready to head home after another successful pickup. "Thank you," I said, "for getting me back safely." He looked at me for a moment, then nodded once. "You did good out there. Followed the rules exactly like you were supposed to. That's not always easy when things get strange." The boat engine started again, and Torres backed away from the dock with the same calm, steady way he'd done everything else. I watched him leave until his running lights were just tiny dots on the water. 3 days on a classified island, doing biological surveys while avoiding things that shouldn't exist. I'd collected the required specimens, documented the required data, and followed every protocol exactly as instructed. The assignment was complete. I loaded my equipment into the waiting government vehicle. I knew this was just the beginning. Tomorrow's meeting with Kaufman would bring new questions, new assignments, and probably new rules for dealing with things the government preferred to keep classified. I'd survived my first encounter with whatever was hiding on that island. The real question was what they'd send me to face next. I walked into Kaufman's office at exactly 9 o'clock, carrying my field bag and the case containing 3 days' worth of carefully documented biological samples. The fluorescent lights cast the same sterile pallor over the room that I remembered from our pre-assignment meeting, and Kaufman sat behind his desk in the same pressed suit, fingers steepled as he watched me settle into the metal chair across from him. "Your survey report," he said, extending one hand toward me. I pulled out my field notebooks and set them on his desk, along with the organized sample containers and my camera's memory card. "I need answers," I said, cutting straight to what mattered. "About what I experienced out there." Kaufman opened the top notebook and began reading my entries with the same measured attention he'd shown when reviewing my assignment parameters. His expression revealed nothing as he scanned pages of plant identification data and soil composition notes. "Your documentation appears thorough and professionally executed," he said after several minutes. "Standard biological survey protocols properly followed." "That's not what I'm talking about, and you know it." I leaned forward in the chair, studying his face for any crack in the bureaucratic front. "James Ballard approached me on the first day. He knew my name, claimed to be my survey partner, had extensive knowledge of the work we were supposedly doing together. He followed me to the cabin and tried to engage me in conversation about coordination and methodology. Kaufman reached into his desk drawer and pulled out a manila file marked with classification stamps I couldn't read from my angle. He opened it and began taking notes in careful handwriting as I spoke. I followed the protocols exactly. I continued. I didn't speak to him, didn't respond to his questions, locked myself in the cabin until he left. But he was there, Kaufman. He was real. He knew things about survey work, and he acted confused when I wouldn't interact with him. "No James Ballard has been assigned to any survey work on that island," Kaufman said, still writing. "Your personnel records clearly indicate you worked alone. Then explain how someone knew my name and had detailed knowledge of biological survey procedures." Kaufman set down his pen and looked at me directly. "Your assignment was a routine biological documentation project. You completed it successfully and returned with comprehensive data. That's what happened." The calm certainty in his voice made my jaw clench. On the second day, I saw a woman in a white dress standing still in the forest. She watched me work from about 50 yards away, never moved, never reacted to wind or sound. I followed the protocol about avoiding women in white dresses and left the area right away. More notes went into the classified file. Kaufman's pen moved across the page as he wrote down details with the same care he'd used when writing the rules I memorized 3 days ago. Later that same day, a child called out for help from the forest. A boy, maybe 8 years old, wearing outdated clothing, walking toward me with his arms stretched out. I followed the protocol about avoiding children in the forest and returned to the cabin. Noted, Kaufman said. That night, something knocked on the cabin door and used my voice to try to get me to open it. My exact voice, Kaufman. Not similar, not close, identical. It knew my name, used my speech patterns, even replicated the slight hoarseness I get when I'm tired. Kaufman continued writing, his expression unchanged by the impossible nature of what I was describing. And yesterday, when pickup time came, someone else arrived first. Young man, athletic build, blonde hair, no beard, no scar. But he spoke with Captain Torres's exact voice, tried to convince me he'd had surgery to explain the different appearance. I followed verification protocols and refused to board his vessel. I sat back in the chair and crossed my arms. So, either you're going to tell me these were all elaborate government training exercises with actors and voice modification technology, or you're going to admit that Island has something on it that doesn't follow normal rules of reality. Kaufman closed the file and set it aside, then picked up a standard payment voucher from his desk. He filled in the amount and date with careful writing, signed it, and slid it across to me. "Congratulations on completing your assignment successfully," he said. "Your attention to detail and adherence to safety protocols was exemplary." I stared at the voucher without picking it up. That's it? No explanation, no acknowledgement of what I experienced, just a pat on the head and a paycheck. "Your security clearance is being upgraded," Kaufman said, returning to his calm, bureaucratic tone. "You'll receive more specialized assignments in the future. Projects that require someone with your particular combination of scientific expertise and ability to follow instructions precisely." It all made sense now. This wasn't just a biological survey gone wrong. This was a test. The government sent me to that island knowing exactly what I'd find, with rules made to keep me alive if I followed them right. They wanted to see if I could deal with weird situations while still getting my job done. "How many people have you sent out there?" I asked. Kaufman opened another folder and looked through what seemed like personnel files. "Your next assignment briefing is in 2 weeks from today. Same time, same place. You'll get the details 2 days before." How many surveyors didn't follow the rules as well as I did? Kaufman's pen stopped moving across the page. He looked up at me with what could have been sympathy, if his face ever showed real feelings. The quiet went on between us, with things left unsaid that I didn't want to think about. "Your payment voucher is ready for processing," he said finally. "Personnel will handle the paperwork for your clearance upgrade within the next week." I picked up the voucher and stood, putting my field bag on my shoulder. The samples and papers would go to whatever lab that looks at stuff from secret government surveys. My notebooks would end up in some secure place where people who knew what really happened on that island would look over my notes and add them to whatever records they kept. "One more question," I said, pausing at the door. "Do you actually need the biological survey data, or was that just cover for the real test?" Kaufman had already turned his attention back to his computer screen, typing away. "Have a good day, Sarah. We'll see you in 2 weeks." I left his office and walked through the building's hallways toward the exit. I passed other government employees busy with their work. The payment voucher in my pocket was for 3 days of field work. I'd made it through something dangerous. The elevator took me down to the lobby, and I stepped out into the regular world of traffic and people. Now I knew this normal life was just what showed on the surface, and underneath, the government handled things they kept secret. In 2 weeks, they'd send me somewhere else to deal with whatever needed my science background and ability to follow strange rules exactly. My higher security clearance meant I'd get jobs that would make my island trip seem easy. I'd made it through my first test by following the rules completely, even when they seemed silly. I wondered what I'd face next, and if just following instructions would be enough to get me through whatever waited in the secret parts of government work. I walked to my car with the payment voucher in my pocket, proof that I'd joined the people who knew the government's regular work was just the visible part of something much stranger.